we see in two places in Exodus and Revelation that God is calling us to be a kingdom of priests, or be kings and priests, if you will, which is goes back to the title. And so we're taking up that mantle now. I mean, we're not, ruling and reigning per se over people in a physical sense, but the same principles apply in our life. And I would say, if the king isn't seated on the throne of your heart, then what you're implementing to the people around you in the community you're in is going to fail. So you are not going to be a benevolent one. You are not going to care for the widows and the orphans and the least of these. That is the heartbeat of God, is service. And so he, by sort of making us many little kings, if you will, we are required to do what a king does.
Hi, welcome to the International Center for World Peace podcast. We're here today with Dr. Dinah Dye. You are doctorate in ministries of Hebrew Christian studies.
Yeah, it's Hebraic Studies in Christianity. It's a D-Min.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So you are also the author of The Temple Revealed in the Garden, and we're going to be exploring some concepts from this book that you've written. So we met you in Orlando a year ago.
Yeah,
hard to believe it's already a year.
Yeah,
right. It's gone so quickly because we were visiting a conference that Rico Cortez had set up called the Treasures, the Temple Treasures Conference.
Treasures of the Temple, yes. It was our fourth one.
And we came to the conference, and as soon as we stepped into the seminars, we were so impressed with the teaching and the learning. We felt a little bit small in our own regard, but we lapped it up. And in particular, we were really impressed with your teaching. And I know that you covered many topics relating to the Torah and the temple, and we were really impressed by that. So,
we were excited to have you. We work in a fairly small community here in the United States. And our teaching team, we've been teaching together for, 5 or 6 years. And you don't expect anyone from outside our little community to actually come in. So to have you guys from UK and Sweden was a real blessing, and to see that now the message can go out further. And I know you were probably fairly surprised at just the level of scholarship that was there. And of course, I've been studying with Joe Good, who's probably the foremost authority on all things structural related to the temple. And right. Joe's been at it for 30 years. And then Rico and I have worked together as well. So it's exciting to me to be here and to be sharing with you guys and letting this message go out, on a worldwide platform. So thank you.
Absolutely, and we appreciate that again. And as Tim said, that's where we met you, and that's where you gave us the book, The Temple Revealed in the Garden, Kings and Priests, and that's what we're going to delve into today.
Well, let me just mention, because it's the second in the series, I decided to write a series called The Temple Revealed, because I kept seeing the pattern of the temple all through the scriptures. And so what I did was I took, the first is the temple revealed in creation, a portrait of the family. So I wanted to look at the creation week and then going into chapter 2. And then I kind of picked it up from there, looking in the garden pattern, the structure. And I'm currently working on the temple revealed in Noah's Ark, chaos to order. I'm halfway through, hoping to get that out by early summer. And I think by the time you finish these 3 volumes, that you would have a very good foundation for understanding temple language and temple pictures all through the scripture. Because I think Abraham, in essence, repeats going back to the story in Genesis and the garden, etc. So that's kind of the plan there.
Yeah. And when we read the book, Tim and I have both read it, we started to see concepts related to temple that we hadn't seen before. And what I really appreciated about your book, and we're going to dive into this, is how you then bring it down to the practical level, the everyday level, and how that relates to our lives. So we're excited to jump into this book and ask you some thoughts about the book.
Yeah.
Well, I've always felt, there's no point giving out information from the Bible if it's not going to have some sort of application in your life. I think there's really a danger in that. There has to be a message. There has to be an underlying message for today to help us, especially we're living in crazy times now. And people, the number one question I get asked is, what do I do? What do we do?
Yeah.
And so if you can point them, I look at three things: the historical patterns, the biblical principles, and what I call godly wisdom. And that sort of formulates how I'm going to present the material to help people move along. So it's important to look at the ancient world and understand in the culture and context, but we have to, we can't leave it there. And as I tell people, I don't want to live in the ancient world. You know what I'm saying? The Father's placed me at this time, but he has given us, we have so many resources now to be able to understand that world in order to make sense of our own.
Right. And I like when you talk about the big picture. I think one of those big picture ideas that is threaded throughout scripture is this concept of temple. And this is, of course, is partly what your book is about. And I know that in your book, you say that Eden, garden, and the field reflect the tripartite aspect of the temple. And I know for most Christians often think about temple in very concrete terms. And I mean, literally concrete terms, bricks and mortar. And they think of the great Solomon temple, the first temple, and then, of course, Herod's temple thereafter. And so when we think about temple, when we come to this concept of temple, we're thinking it in very concrete terms. Yet this idea of temple where heaven meets earth, this idea that temple is symbolic of the presence of God, that actually temple themes and ideas transcend the building itself. And so one of the things you draw out in your book is just that, is this Eden is actually a temple in itself. And one thing you tease out is that it has three parts. There's Eden, the garden, and the field. And you relate these three parts to the built temple itself. And I just want, if you'd like to expand on that and explain how they connect, how
Sure.
Eden connects to the temple.
And of course, I owe much of it to scholars that have come before me. As I began to, I think it was about 10 years ago when I started to realize that this was the pattern of all of creation, and that God himself has created a cosmos, an ordered universe, so that his presence would dwell in the midst of his people. So I began to read a lot of different scholars and began to see the pattern pretty quickly. And it's pretty well agreed upon this. And of course, the ancient world was divided up in this tripartite structure. And we see this with the Ten Commandments. As you're reading through the commandments on the Sabbath day, it talks about God restoring the heavens, the earth, and the sea. You see that over and over again, this again, tripartite structure. And then really, if you start evaluating temples, virtually every one of them is structured that way. Now, we understand that Eden, although we look at everything in a horizontal terms, on a flat plane, the idea of Eden was as a mountain. And mountains become tremendously important in scripture as well, which I go into in my third book. I talk about that quite a bit. So the visual is, vertical, and we're so used to thinking of it horizontal. So of course, when we go to Solomon's temple, we look at it as we're walking in so if we were going into the temple, in particular, the ulam, the porch, then the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, we see that tripartite structure within the temple building itself. And now to take it back and look at the entirety of the cosmos in the same way. And so I was trying to really give the readers that sense. So Eden, in the same way, as I began to read different ones like John Walton and G.K. Beale and numbers of others, I realized that, the top of the mountain, if Eden is a mountain, represented Eden as that inner sanctuary. Just as the same way that Moses, when he ascended the mountain, you see that in Exodus 24, when he is in the presence of God with the fire. Numbers 24 tells us with the sapphire paving stones, he's in the presence of God at the oracle of God. So the inner chamber. And then halfway down, although, I don't quite picture a garden halfway down a mountain, but you know what I'm saying? In the story of Moses, we had the elders, so functioning as the priests who would be mediating between the people and Moses, and obviously, ultimately God. And then below was sort of be outside the camp. And I kind of coined these three myself. Walton kind of came the closest to what I was thinking about, but this imagery of Eden as heaven, the garden in the middle, the holy place represented, and then below. Of course, in the ancient world, you'd have the seas, or the underworld, or the sort of the place that belonged to the Gentile nations, if you will.
Yeah.
So this structure becomes important, and of course, once we build Solomon's temple, we see which pieces of furniture went in, which section and for what reason. So I began to try to tie those things together as well. But this overall picture, I can't even tell you how many times you start reading through scripture and it'll say heaven, earth, and sea, and you just start seeing it everywhere. So that kind of helps you get a much larger picture of God and his presence in the entirety of the universe, instead of, but he took it down. There's always a sacred center. And so earth became the center between heaven and the seas. And of course, he would establish his throne on earth through his king or representative.
Something I thought was especially interesting about that tripartite structure is the way you expressed that Eden is God's domain. It's God's space, and that it is this ideal that we should be striving towards.
And that's what's so beautiful about the message of Yeshua, Jesus, because it was the priests who were the ones that would bring together heaven and earth, if you will. So let me back up just a little bit, because one of the problems we have, especially in Christianity, so if we're talking about heaven, everybody's, going out into outer space and looking at, the constellations. And that's not how the ancients saw it. So heaven in their mind was the location of the temple. The temple, of course, was supposed to house the God of the ancients. And so the domain of the king, if you will, who sat on the throne in the temple representing the God, was heaven. So when you entered the temple, you entered heaven. You didn't go into outer space. And so we have these spheres. That the sphere of earth was for the people, the folks. And so the priest was called to mediate between earth and heaven. So the priest was the priest would ascend the mountain, if you will, into the presence of the king, get their marching orders or do whatever, and then take that message down, to the people below. And the perfect picture, of course, is Moses. We see him, in the presence of God on top of the mountain in the glory. And then, of course, he's going to bring down to the people what we call the oracle of God, or the commandments, the tablets of destiny or testimony, and try to govern the people. So the idea that Yeshua has made a way for us to have access into this place called the Holy of Holies, or the presence of God. So we don't have to wait for someone else to do it. It's that he has made a way for us to come into the presence of the King. One of the things I'd like to say too, you guys have a better understanding of monarchy and kingship.
Right.
And I have really been struggling to try to communicate the message to Americans, because they have no concept. Now, I grew up in Canada, so I have a little bit of the Queen thing, but over and all, it's very difficult. They simply cannot wrap their heads around being ruled by a king. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Particularly in a republic, as you say. And what sovereignty means, and kingship means.
It's a challenge. And so here we have the Bible, which is all about kingship. It's all about the king being seated on his throne in the temple, because if you don't have a temple, you don't have a king. So this is a hard thing to break through in sort of mainline American Christianity.
Yeah. You actually go into a lot of detail describing the figure of Adam as a king in the Garden of Eden story, and you explain him as the installed king, as God's representative.
Yes.
Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more how this is so, and what does it have to do with us, and how do our responsibilities of kingship relate to this?
So I have to say, I mean, this is my opinion, okay? I think there'd be some scholars that would agree, but typically we kind of argue over Adam, is he humanity? Is he, just a man? Is with the family? I'm not sure that the Bible is really that concerned about it. And as I look at the Bible as well, there are many things that it's not concerned about it. I think the focus is on the line of the kings. So we have God Yahweh, and he has created a place for his presence, but now he has this special sacred center, if you will, the earth, where he wants someone to rule and reign over the earth, to bring so that the earth is in order, not in chaos. And so the king was the one who would bring order to that sphere. And so we see, I mean, it's clear we have the line of Adam to Noah. And I would suggest that this is the line of the kings, because we see it in Matthew. We go from Adam to second Adam.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, yeah, there's other people and there's other dynasties and, there's other lives going on, but the Bible isn't concerned about it. It's focused in on if this is, in fact, a person, this one person who would be the living representative of Yahweh on earth, which is what the role of a king was supposed to be. The king was supposed to represent the God, whoever the God was over the city, the particular city state. And so Adam functions in that role, but he is the living image of God, which is what's so. One of the things I find fascinating is that the Bible, I think, has at its core the idea to upend or deconstruct the world around it, the world empire. And it's presenting a very different view in some ways than how the world is operating. Things are the same, but things are different. And so typically, like, for example, if you had a king and he was going off to fight in a war, he would leave behind, the God would have him leave behind a representation of the king in stone or wood or something, but it would have the face of the God on it. They needed to have something standing in the temple so that the people had something to worship if the king was, in absentia. But so, and yet God is put in his presence into his king Adam it doesn't matter whether he's in the temple or not, to go out and bring the message of who Yahweh is to the world. And so this idea of kingship, I think, is, well, honestly, the point of building a temple is to house the throne so the king can sit on the throne and rule and reign. I think it's just that simple. And so again, the earth becomes this picture of the garden, and Adam is seated on the throne, and he's the king or the agent. He's the agent of God, his representative, but the living, breathing agent who is supposed to go out and spread seed, if you will, to the entire earth in order to rule and reign under the sovereignty of God.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what your point about there being a second Adam and how that shines back a light on the first Adam and what the first Adam was created for. Because what do we see in the second Adam, Yeshua or Jesus? We see somebody who came into the world to be born a king and to be King of Kings. And so that reflects back on the actual purpose, not necessarily explicitly said in Genesis, but the purpose of Adam, that he too was, so like you say, to be God's representative and to rule with God in partnership with him, to, like you say, spread order around the world. And when we think about that, I mean, it's fascinating because, of course, we are made after the likeness of the first Adam, and then we will be made after the likeness of the second Adam. So how does that idea of kingship relate to our lives, the practicalities of our lives, of people of faith? How does that help us live our lives, or what does it reflect about our responsibility in this earth?
So the purpose of the king was to bring order to the empire or whatever environment he was king in. And he did that by, first of all, defeating all his enemies. Like, in order for the king to be seated on the throne in a temple, he had to get rid of the enemies first. Once the enemies were gone, then the temple could be built and he would be seated on the throne. And of course, he was supposed to govern the people. And we see the example again of Moses. He was given the governing documents, the Torah, in order to be able to rule benevolently over the people. And so the king was to be seated on the throne. His rule was to be benevolent and to provide for the least among these. Which, there's the heartbeat of the Torah. You don't find that in the other ancient cultures. Their kings would, browbeat them, enslave them, military occupation, all that sort of thing. But then here's this Torah. that goes to the heart of God, that life is valuable above all else. And he is concerned about the widows and the orphans and those with no voice and the foreigners. And so that was within the Torah, the governing documents, if you will, of the kingdom of Israel. The king was to exercise righteousness and justice, and whatever policies he put in place made life good. The other thing that a king was responsible for in the ancient world was to provide food, essentially, for his subjects, because in most places the king owned all the land, and so people were just slaves working for the gods and the king, in order to feed the king. So the king was to provide for his people to eat. I mean, that's something the ancient people understood all too well. So that's why we see a lot of agricultural language in the scriptures. So now if we take that, we see in two places in Exodus and Revelation that God is calling us to be a kingdom of priests, or be kings and priests, if you will, which is goes back to the title. And so we're taking up that mantle. Now, I mean, we're not ruling and reigning per se over people in a physical sense, but the same principles apply in our life. And I would say, if the king isn't seated on the throne of your heart, then what you're implementing to the people around you and the community you're in is going to fail. So you are not going to be a benevolent one. You are not going to care for the widows and the orphans and the least of these. That is the heartbeat of God, is service. And so he, by sort of making us many little kings, if you will, we are required to do what a king does. And the other thing, I mean, we're required to feed people, which the gospel talks a lot about. I mean, we of course, we see, what did Yeshua do? We talk about that in more detail in a bit, but one of the main things he does is feed the people. I mean, that was perfectly normal for kings. And I always tell people, what would have been amazing in the first century is that kings, they're in their ivory tower, in the temple, up in, quote unquote, heaven on the mountain. They could care less about anything, least of all their subjects. And then in the first century, here is the King of Kings walking among his people, doing all the things a king is supposed to do, raising the dead, feeding the people, clothing them, giving sight to the blind, and healing. And so he is the perfect representation of Yahweh on earth. And so now that spirit is to be in God's people. We are supposed to model that and be kings in our communities and do exactly the same thing, to lighten the load and give and set the captives free, because people around us are just enslaved to the gods of this world. And we come with a message: you can be free, and free indeed.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating concept and way of explaining it. Basically, our kingship under God is basically, it's so counterintuitive to this world that it's actually, the kingship is about service and stewardship, which was so contrary to the kingship of the ancient Hebrew times.
Yeah, so we look at Adam, he's called to cultivate and guard the garden. So to cultivate the soil, and protect the sacred space. And we're called in essence to help cultivate the soil of the hard hearts of those around us, and then to provide protection for them, which of course comes in when they make a covenant with God. And also the cultivation, the idea of the cultivation, the two things, and marriage, because the marriage relationship perfectly represents the covenant that God established between the heavens and the earth. Unfortunately, because that's not terribly concrete for people, right? Like if you go to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In essence, he's making a covenant between heaven and earth. And then if you go down into chapter 2, it says these are the toldot of the heavens and the earth. And that Hebrew word toldot means to bring forth children. So you're like, these are the children that come forth from heaven and earth. Like, what kind of sense does that even make? That's very subjective and sort of ethereal, if you will. But all it is talking about is the unity between two spheres, really between God, King, and his servants, son, Adam, in the beginning, but also with us, that a covenant is being made. And part of the covenant, when a covenant made, means that covenant protections are given to those within the covenant. So that's another part of this, that we're instructed to show people that when you restore, renew, whatever, the covenant with God, he will provide protection and provision for you. And then you're to take that and to show people, this is how you make a covenant with God. And this is what he'll provide you with. And this is how he'll work in your life. And this is how he'll transform you and change you into his image.
Yeah, there's some fascinating thoughts. I'm just going to tail end off what Tim and you were saying there, because it was an organic thought that came up in my head. But I thought, imagine how our lives would be ordered differently if every morning we woke up and we thought, right, I'm a king of my own sphere. And we all have a sphere. We all have a sphere of influence, right. Whether it's the place that you work, whether it's the place you live, whether it's your family, whether it's your circle of friends, we are all king in some sphere. And if we woke up with that mindset of like, okay, I'm king and I'm responsible for ordering the world that I have influence over. It reminded me of a story. Again, I'm going off script here, but it reminded me of a story I read in a book about Sean Covey, how 7 Habits for Highly Effective Teens. And he talks about a story in there about a French king who was destined to be king. Of course, he was heir to the throne, and he'd been captured. I think it's King Louis. I can't remember the number that comes after the king. And of course, what they try to do is they try to tempt this king with all kinds of food that he shouldn't eat and certain immorality that he shouldn't engage in. But the child, I can't remember how old he was, but he just says no to everything. And they can't seem to break him down. And at the end, they say, why are you not taking all of these temptations? And his response is, because I'm born to be a king. And I just think, if it's a mindset, if we realize that we reflect the image of God, and we have also been called to kingship, as you've said in Revelation 1:6, that we're called to be kings and priests, then I think we live more we have more capacity to live in our potential.
I agree. Yeah. And here's one of the other issues. So there are certain covenant obligations and promises that go with that. And so a lot of the terms that we use, so even like with the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, self-control, etc., and the concept of faith, loving kindness, mercy, all of these are covenant attributes. The problem is for us today, they're very abstract. So if we talk about faith, like that's probably one of the most abstract terms you can use. So people are thinking, oh, I just got to have enough faith, like somehow they're going to emotionally create enough faith to get through. Whereas in many places in the New Testament, it probably would have been better translated allegiance. So faith and loyalty and loving kindness, these are all aspects of how you approach the king, with allegiance, with that kind of loyalty. And this is it's difficult to get people to rearrange their thinking because they have a very abstract view of all of these attributes. And so I think allegiance is probably, again, because people don't have a good understanding of kingship and monarchy, etc., they don't really understand what allegiance and loyalty even means.
Interesting. I just had an idea, totally out of the box here, but something that I think about with royalty as well and family, coming from a European country, something that I think often is missed out in the idea of royalty is the idea of family. Like family is at the core of royalty and
dynasty.
Yeah.
Dynasty is the key. The house. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't want to forget. When we're talking about in the beginning and God's creating and he's building out of the 7 days of creation, he's building a house as a place for his presence. He's also building a dynasty from Adam to second Adam. And so you're exactly right. We are seeing listed the royal dynasty through all of the various patriarchs, the pre-flood patriarchs and the post-flood patriarchs. And so that's, the king had to have an heir. I mean, I don't have time to go into all this, but the purpose of the harem was to create heirs to the throne. And so there's so much language in the Bible about royal dynasty and heirs and seed. And of course, all manifests itself through Yeshua the Messiah, the son of David, not just the son of David, but he is the heir, the seed not just to the throne, but to the whole earth, because that was the inheritance that God was giving to his king. The royal grant covenant was the earth. And so that's where Yeshua restores it back into, a much bigger picture of the restoration of that. That makes sense.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about kingship, but another idea that you draw out here and that we've touched a little bit on is the priesthood of Adam and his role as you talk about his role as priesthood as expressed by cultivating it and protecting of the garden, and how is this service how this service reflects the praises of God back to him. How is Adam a priest?
Well, so in the ancient world, and we think pre-flood, although, with the dates, we're not 100% sure here, but kings were priests early on. There wasn't a separation between the two roles, and that did come much later. And I would argue that even when we were at the point with Moses, he is certainly, we see him functioning in a role as king, but also as priest, as intermediary and intercessor on behalf of the people. So I think those roles for Adam were not separated, that they were, they had different manifestations, but he was priest, king. We see that. And then, of course, as we move on down the line, once we get to the time of David and Saul and Solomon, et cetera, obviously that's all, we have a separate high priest, we have the priesthood, and we have the kingship. So I think Yeshua is to reinstitute that priest-king thing and to restore both, because clearly as he's ministering in ways of intercession and repentance, and of course the processes that priests were responsible for, but he was also obviously walking in kingship, maybe not in the fullness of it, but both. I think his role was to restore both things. I think I read Michael Morales. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but he said something that worship was the telos of creation. And so that Greek word there, telos, we typically translate like it's the end, as in on a on a line here, that's the end, finished. But it should be better translate goal, that worship is the goal of creation. But again, we want to put that back in the kingship thinking. Once again, since people don't understand kingship and they don't understand, the attributes that go with kingship, then they have a hard time understanding what worship is. So, I think for the minds of most Americans, I think they see worship as, you just get down on your face and, worship this entity, instead of showing loyalty to the king, allegiance to the king, but in that your life manifests those things as well, giving honor. It's more about honor and identity and loyalty than it is, getting flat on the floor and, bowing down, kind of like you see in the movies. Does that make sense?
Would you say that it's about how you order your life as well?
Oh, absolutely. Because the number one attribute of the king and the number one attribute, I should say, of the ancient world was order. So one of the things, the God of the king always imparted wisdom to the king so that he would bring order to the empire. So kind of order and wisdom go hand in hand. But yes, when you meet someone and their life is chaos, you don't even want to be around them. Okay, just like put up a barrier, you stay over there. And when it starts happening in your own family, it just creates insanity. I mean, we are currently living in a world of complete and utter insanity because there's no order, logic, rationality, or wisdom or common sense anywhere. And so the very nature of human beings is to create order in their lives so they can function, because you cannot function in a chaotic state.
Right, exactly. And it reminds me of the first job description given to Adam to dress and keep the garden, which is essentially to protect it and guard it. And you express in your book that this is actually an externalization of the responsibility God has given Adam in his ordering aspect, that he is asking Adam to order the world or extend that order continually, and maintain it, which is another thing. And this is where I became fascinated when the section of the book I read where you're expressing this, with this idea that you're talking about now, that kingship and priesthood are merged. I'd known that Adam was called to be a king. I'd studied, I'd read, I'd realized looking at the second Adam, but the idea of priesthood I was unfamiliar. And one thing you mentioned, and again, it surprised me, in studies I've done, I've referred to it, and I've quoted your book, I've referenced your book, so that there we go. That you actually say that there is some language when it comes to the tabernacle and the temple that's been borrowed from Eden. So again, it looks like that the temple functions and ceremonies and activities are echoing Eden, and so they kind of a reflection of one another. And we have the voice of God in Eden being the same Hebrew word used as the presence of God. We have Adam having to work and guard the garden. Those two Hebrew words are used in regarding to the Levites who have to guard the temple and then do this activities and ceremonies. And then, of course, you got the idea of Gihon being one of the rivers, 4 rivers flowing from Eden. And then the idea in Ezekiel 47, 48, you got Gihon going out of the temple. That is the spring from in Jerusalem. And watering the whole earth. So we see this language, this connection, syntactic, if you like, connection between Eden and the activities. And so Adam here is doing what the priest should do.
So when we look at the creation week, there's a Hebrew word that goes with that kind of work. It's called melacha. But then when we come to the completion of the temple, the cosmos temple, and God moves in, because you got to move in after you build. And now he takes over the operation of the cosmos. And then he raises up his king to do the hands-on work in the garden sanctuary. And the word switches there. It's no longer melacha, but it's avad, to work, to serve. Yeah. Sometimes it's used for a slave, but that becomes the term service, avodah. So the work switches on the 7th day. And so when you go into the temple precincts, most of the work is done on the 7th day, on the Shabbat. It's not the day we think of it, the day of rest, as a kickback. I'm not going to do anything, maybe watch a football game, read a book. This is the crowning day of creation. The king, the rest means he's seated on the throne and everything is operating under that sphere. So now the priests go to work on the 7th day, and then the services become, the work that they do. And the services are all designed to keep the covenant intact and to mediate between two spheres, between heaven and earth. The priests are the ones called to bring together the two parties, God, God and his subjects, or God and his people. And so the myriad of services that are in the temple, and much of them, when you think about it, have to do with food or something with agriculture. Now, I do talk about, the garden pattern is dealing with agriculture. And then once we move past through the Noah period, we see animal husbandry, obviously, because Noah builds an altar and sacrifices the burnt offering on there. But so much of the language, so much of the work of the priesthood has to do with agriculture. And then we see that with Yeshua. So much of what he does in his life is related to, gardening, kingship, gardening. He talks about fig trees and grapevines, and, we mentioned, or I don't know if I mentioned in this show, but, when the Miriams went to the tomb and they were looking for Yeshua and the tomb is empty, what do they see? They see a gardener, which he could have been a gardener. However, the message was they were seeing a king. So the restoration, there's so much to do with the land, the earth, and what comes forth. And, even looking at Adam, Cain and Abel, Cain brought the first fruits of the earth. That was a normal offering. So the priests intercede in that way with so much of the service having to do with, growing food and bringing the food offerings from trees and shrubs and, what have you from the earth. So again, going back to Adam and cultivating the land and the soil is a big deal in scripture. And I don't have to tell you when you read the parable of the soils, right?
Right.
Duh. So it's related to kingship.
Right. And there's this lovely expression that you express towards the end of the book about working in the soil of people's hearts, that we as priests called us into God's family at this time, that we too are a kingdom of priests, a nation of priests. And so we can work in the soil of people's hearts by sowing a good word. And of course, that word is God's word itself, and doing other things that will help that person and serve that person and work the soil, if you like.
Amen. I mean, really, it's all about good soil.
Yeah.
And I live in a place, 6,700 feet above sea level with rotten soil. And every time I'm out there, we get a lot of wind. It's the plains, kind of like Texas, and it's just hard to grow stuff. And I get very frustrated. And if it isn't that, it's the insects and the bugs and the moles and the voles and the gophers. It's just, and I go, how on earth,
Well, it's just
looks like you're working in a lot of thorns and thistles.
Yeah. So, maybe a little humorous point, but I was recently given a gift, a peace lily, a gift from a friend, and it's actually behind the camera at the moment. And Tim yesterday, he came over from Sweden and said, oh, he expressed surprise that the plant that I owned is still alive. So I can say that I'm doing the work of the kingdom.
You are.
But what you're doing is describing the work of the kingdom, and a kingdom we've been called to. And another thing, thinking about the idea of temple threaded throughout scripture, is that you explain that the temple furniture actually reveals the function of the kingdom. The temple furniture, the items, the vessels that were in the temple actually can teach us something about how the kingdom can function. Wondered if you could expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, and so again, I would just preface this by saying, this was my opinion, and I kind of got a little creative here, sort of put these things together. But I was fascinated because, in fact, I don't know if you guys follow the Parsha readings, the regular weekly Torah readings. This past week was Exodus 25. It's called Terumah, but it starts with the blueprint for building the tabernacle. And what's so fascinating is, the blueprint didn't start with the structure of the tabernacle like you normally lay the foundation and then start, putting up the sticks and making a structure. It starts with the Ark of the Covenant, and it moves from the center out. And so when you look at, the Holy of Holies, the piece of furniture that's in the Holy of Holies, of course, being the throne, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Testimony. And then inside that, we have the three elements, the manna, the tablets of stone, and the staff that was the almond blossoms on Aaron's staff. And I thought, well, if we're starting in the center, these three elements also kind of need to be moved out, into the world. Right. So I sort of saw this visual as we moved out into the holy place, where we have three pieces of furniture there. The menorah, the 7-branch menorah. We have the table of showbread, the shulchan lepen hapanim, and we have the altar of incense. I thought, well, each one of them kind of had a reflection to me of what was actually in the Ark of the Covenant, which was, again, the throne of God. So I'm thinking, what is the message of those three things? And then I began to look at the service of those three and how the priests were chosen for the service, chosen by lot. Usually only ever did it once in their life. And just I describe in my book just the service of the menorah, for example, and how the priest, what it took to prepare and what had to be done. And I mean, everything is well choreographed, well oiled. And if you violated that, you were dead meat, basically. Yeah. And so these wonderful pictures come into play as the menorah is kind of a representation of the tree of life. And then, the oil, how the priests trimmed the wicks and how often they did it, and which particular oil base was left to have the eternal flame in it. What that meant for the people. And typically, for example, the menorah, the trunk of the tree, would represent the divine presence of the king. And so we're just taking, the light of the world, you see it, manifest in Yeshua. And I thought back into the story of Moses, and you see him, out in Sinai. Remember, the mountain represents a temple pattern, and then he sees this bush, you know, um, burning but not being consumed. And so the imagery here of the tree of life in the center of the garden, now in the temple, and this is his holy place. He takes off his shoes, it's sacred space. But the idea again to bring that light out to the world. And we see that with the table of showbread. It's better called the bread of the presence. And although there's an argument over whether it's leavened or unleavened bread, the idea was that the bread represented the presence of God. And so there's a whole service that went on with, the 12 loaves, and the flour would be go through a sieve 11 times. And then they'd put frankincense in bowls on the table. And then how they got the bread off the table when it was Shabbat and put the new bread back on. And you have the bread. The high priest would eat 5 of the loaves, and 7 of the loaves would be eaten by the remaining priests. And I couldn't help but think about David when he went into the tabernacle and he was hungry, and I think it was one of those guys. I can't remember which one, but he gave him the 5 loaves, like acting as a priest. I mean, there's just this language. And then we move out to Yeshua, and he's there feeding the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, bringing the idea of the bread of the presence out from the place, the temple, which at the time was very corrupt. He was railing against the corruption of the high priesthood. It's, they're buying and selling and trading and, all kinds of stuff, and lording it over the people. And now he's out and he's bringing the bread of the presence that's, baked in the temple, and he's bringing it to the people and providing the food of life to them in the 5 loaves. And then we have some other descriptions as well. So you can go back and you can examine these services in detail, and then you just see how Yeshua, Jesus, fulfills that role. Again, the role of priest. So he, it's the double priest king thing. So there's just fascinating connections all over the place. And we could, the services, you could talk till the cows come home, and you could never fully describe them. But just in those 3, in the altar of incense, you see the cloud go up, the effort to connect heaven and earth, of course, representing the prayers of the saints. It's magnificent and endless.
Yeah. That's something that I really enjoyed about your book, the way you illustrate how the temple is like a microcosmos, and it connects heaven and earth, but also the way you describe the narrative of the priests and their service, how they attended their service with joy and with excitement and with precision and with care, and it makes me think that this must be a pattern in which we should tend and care to our communities and the world as well.
And so you just take those 3 pieces of furniture, if you will. I mean, again, the idea of the light we are to bring the light of the world to people. We are to bring the bread of the presence to people, and we were to bring, the incense, the prayers to God on behalf of the people. It's a beautiful picture. But again, I always start with the concrete. Whenever I'm researching, I go back and I try, I want to know historically, geographically, contextually, sociology, all of it, to understand what's going on. And then after I understand that well, then I try to make the sort of more creative connections to help people engage the material.
And that's something I think we both really appreciated about your book. It's how you go from these really broad theoretical concepts of the Bible, from the Bible, and you draw them into these very practical applications. And one specific area that I think was really interesting was the idea of image bearing and the clash that idolatry causes. So would you be able to explain a little bit, how does the concept of image bearing and idolatry clash?
Well, so one of the first things, I mean, what's unique about us is we are living images. And of course, the king would actually be called the idol of his God, because he was the representation of the God. He wasn't actually the God, but he was the representation. And I had also talked in my book some about, so in the ancient world, what we find is most temples only had one tree, a tree of life in it. And so what's unusual, again, this idea how in Israel's economy, we subvert world empire. We create a story that's different than the nations around, and we upend it in some way. So now we have a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you just don't find that anywhere. So as I was reading a number of different scholars, they talked about it, sort of representing the sort of justice tree, the place where justice is exercised. Again, that would go back to the king's obligations to his people, and the idea of the idol. What was interesting is that it also represented sort of the moral and ethical elements of the kingdom. And so it was, in fact, that Adam, in eating from that tree, was just taking the moral and ethical authority of God and putting it on himself to decide what was right and wrong. And so all of that, I think, comes back to the kingship of usurping someone else's power. I mean, that's kings go off and fight wars militarily to conquer and take, they're going to defeat their neighboring king. And so in essence, Adam, mankind, humans, trying to do the same thing. And I think it's really manifested itself in very ugly ways in our present world, is that we've taken our own moral and ethical authority and, basically are trying, certain ones in our communities are trying to lord it over others and govern according to that measure of what ethical and moral I can't even think of the word, but you understand what I'm saying. We're in very dangerous territory because we have we've done exactly what Adam did, only now it's the whole world. And we've thrown out God's moral authority because it's the thing that brings order to society. And we're desperate to keep and maintain order, which is the king's job, but we've thrown out the king. So here we are.
Yeah. Some of the things you're saying are reminding me, or at least reflect some of the experiences that we have in real time in interacting in the world. Now, just to telescope out a small bit, we have so much of our culture that has historically been based on Judeo-Christian values and value systems. And some of the great progress we've seen over the last couple of centuries have been as a result of, in part, ordering culture, society, intellectual institutions, even government, according to those principles and those laws. And I think a consequence of that is that there was great advancements. For one example is the protection of certain rights in law, because people or society generally saw us as special creations, as image bearers of God. And that doesn't come out of nothing. That is a specific Judeo-Christian idea. Now, in the recent years, we have seen, as we've gotten further away or rejected more of those principles and ideas, we have had to supplant that with a different value system. And this is something that, when you're speaking just then, reminded me of it, when you start to see the other value systems starting to be activated in society, things start to break down. And it's like, wait a minute, like what I used to think was wrong is what is that or not wrong? And what I thought was right is now seen as a problem. And so I think this is the danger. And I think that can end up infecting culture and society. And you can see the breakdown of that and some of the problems that we're seeing in culture in particular because of that rejection.
And my husband and I were talking about it this morning, in fact, because we've had a structure in place. And I say I was born after World War II. I'm the 50s baby boomer generation, and our institutions were basically Judeo-Christian culture by and large, and so we had this structure. But what we're seeing now, and I mean it's been going on for a while, but it's really going on now, is that this other structure is being built on a different foundation, and it feels as though when the powers that be get to a certain point and decide that their structure is the structure, then they're going to just totally tear down the one we have. And so we're kind of in this place now where it could go either way. It's like two two structures existing, one inside the other, and it's kind of like who's going to win on this, on this front. It's very very disconcerting, very scary. I'm quite worried about where we're going. But again, to me, it goes back to the very basic of what the Bible is speaking of, and that is making a covenant with your Creator. And so when you break the covenant, excuse my language, hell breaks loose. And so the Bible, if you look in the Bible, there's a lot of descriptions of sort of cosmic, cataclysmic events, the sun darkening, the moon turning, the blood, stars falling. All of that was related to, I would suggest, the destruction of the temple, especially the destruction of Solomon's temple. So when it came down, this is how they described it, because they lost their temple, they lost their king, their monarchy, their institutions, they lost everything, and then they went into exile. And that's kind of, I feel that that's the place where we're in. So whenever you see this sort of language, it's talking about, it's not just the destruction of a physical house, but it's the destruction of the house that's built when you make a covenant between two parties. That thing is just blown apart. And so all of these consequences are coming upon us, like you were talking about, because we have broken covenant with our God.
That's a really fascinating thought. I think one of those consequences, because we have rejected covenant, we've rejected relationship, and we've rejected the concept that we are under authority, that we are not gods. Like,
right.
we are not gods. I know in Psalms it says ye are gods, but of course Jesus is referring to the fact that we're autonomous, we have godlike capacities. But because once you reject God and you set yourself up as your own authority, then I think there's a direct reaction to that. And I think we're seeing it in society, that because of that, we see ourselves and our opinions and our ideas as the end point, if you like, the telos of existence, not the service of God, not the praise of God, but
right.
gratification of oneself, because we are gods. And I think this is something that you unpick at the end of your book, that one of the consequences of this rejection is that we see a society turn in on itself, where subjective reality is over and above objective reality, and that immediate gratification is something that is infected our society. And we have a very kind of self-indulgent, if you like, maximum validation for minimum input. And this is often one of the criticisms of the millennials. And so this is something that I think is a consequence of the rejection of a specific idea that, God is God and not we. And based on what we've discussed today, how might some of the ideas that we've discussed speak into a generation that tends to be, I guess you could say, self-indulgent, narcissistic, I guess, if we're going to go Greek mythology there, and very entitled, because obviously the idea of once you put yourself up as God, rights end up being superior to responsibilities. And we know that there's this whole kind of tension between, I want my rights here and not tend to the responsibilities of ordering your own well. So what are some of the ideas that we've discussed today that speak to this generation to help maybe pull ourselves back from the precipice in which you're describing?
Well, we pretty much agree. I mean, we are definitely a post-Christian Judaic culture. I mean, we've even moved past, I think, secular humanism. The latest thing I talk about is transhumanism. I'm going, I don't even know what to do with that. We are, the slope is not just slippery, we are flying down it.
Yeah, like a toboggan.
So in this environment, in this cult, I mean, when you think about the period of time, and I'm speaking from the United States, when we were a Judeo-Christian nation, and people felt perfectly content, confident, whatever, to go out into the community and you just say, I believe in Jesus and Jesus is my savior and Jesus saved me and I'm not going to hell and I'm going to heaven, Well, you can't have any kind of dialogue like that now. Don't think you're from Mars. So the Bible has no reference point whatsoever especially to these young people. So I do believe we have to figure out a way to try to reconnect, because yes, we are image bearers, we are role models, and how we operate in the community is very important, because when people see our lives that are in order and functioning as they're supposed to, and their lives are in chaos, that's an opportunity for them to come to us and say, how can I have an ordered life?
Right.
Or when you see, people in need, and you don't, you're not preaching the way, I was just suggesting, but that you go and, you help those. I mean, we have many stories here in New Mexico of people helping to raise babies, that were destined to be aborted. I mean, real concrete, on the ground things that help people's lives and ease those heavy burdens and loads. So, I mean, to me, that goes without saying, modeling God's presence in us to the world. But I'm thinking, how do we get back to the principles of the Bible, the wisdom that is I think it's the wisdom of the ages of, how do we show people that this is where wisdom dwells? This is where common sense comes out of, like, the book of Proverbs, for example. And these kids, they're not going to pick up the Bible and read it. Like, there's no reference point. This is some old white man thing. What am I going to get out of that? So, I had the opportunity, it's been about a year. I was at a conference and they asked me if I would teach the teens. Now, I haven't taught a bunch of teens in quite some time. So, sure, no problem. So I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for them all to come in, and I'm going, oh, Lord, help. I don't even know where to start with this. There's a lot of years between the two of us. So I started out, I just asked them, I just wanted to find out where they were at. And basically, it was so depressing. None of them read the Bible. They rarely prayed. They thought all the heroes in the Bible lived super lives and they couldn't possibly measure up, so why even bother? They didn't want to be there. Their parents made them. They rarely ever shared with their friends anything to do with the Bible. They got nothing, zero. And these are kids that, would know better. So I'm going, oh my goodness. So what I did was I regrouped and I decided to go back to the Genesis, basically, to try to answer the questions that they have. So the number one question they always have is, well, if Adam and Eve were the only two people on the earth, like, where did Cain get a wife, and Seth and Abel and the rest of them? And, it made no sense to them. So I started to answer the questions concretely based on my ancient Near East research and putting things together on how this could make sense. And I'm telling you, those kids were completely transformed within an hour. They were like, this is so cool. I'm so excited. You could see the joy and the excitement. Now, I don't know how long it lasted, at least through the conference. And the parents came and said, what did you tell those kids? But I realized we have done a very poor job of answering the questions, logical questions that these kids have. We just dismiss. It's in the Bible. Jesus loves you. And if you don't believe it, too bad, kind of thing, without giving them real good answers that make sense. And once they start grasping onto those things that make sense, I think things could really change. And that's why my hope is I want to try to write something, down at more in high school level to try to reach the young ones with answers to their questions that they can't, no one's ever given them an answer. They go in on Sunday, listen to the preacher, he talks about whatever, same thing every week, right? Put your money over here, we're good. And it just is not, it's not reaching them. It's not penetrating their heart. It's not making sense. And they're like, why bother? Why should I go out there? So I think our understanding of the Bible has to go to where I think it was intended to be. We understand it was written to an ancient Near East culture, but we also understand we can make the application for today. But I have uncovered so many things that I finally went, well, that makes sense. And now I don't have time now. You'll have to read my third book. But I did a whole section on the sons of God and the daughters of men, because haven't you heard the most bizarre explanation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4? And is it completely correct? I don't know, but it makes sense. That's what people are desperate for, making sense of the world around them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That there is a hunger for that, for those answers, and to make sense of a lot of confusion.
Yeah, and to your point just now, I think it's just great to hear that experience that you had with those kids, because it really shows the power of the story of the Bible, the power of the story of Jesus, and how there's so much meaning to be drawn out of the Torah,
Yeah.
out of the story of Jesus, and how it helps us find our place in the world.
Yep.
And I think that's the challenge of today that we're discussing right now. It's people are out of place in the world because we've lost our identity. We've lost the fact that we are, not us particularly, but the world has lost their idea that they are made in the image of God. And what is the outcome of that? What is the result of that? Well, it's chaos and disorder. It's the opposite of God. God brings order out of chaos.
Amen.
And I think the end result becomes a focus on self-indulgence. And I think that's something you highlighted in your book, and how that ultimately leads to these obsessions of the mind, like whether it's addictions or basically anything could become an addiction, whether it's power, sex, drugs, alcohol, money.
Yeah, just it's a symptom.
Yeah.
It's not the root cause, it's a symptom.
Right.
And I think you make a good point, because in the ancient world, I talked about the value of order and wisdom, but the other thing was identity. So when you made a covenant, when two parties made a covenant, that gave you an identity, and you exchanged your name. So when God and Israel make a covenant, he becomes the God of Israel, they become the children of God, kind of thing. And identity was another value that was high up there on the list. And to lose your identity was to lose everything. So you think about when the northern tribe, when it was exiled into the Assyria, and the southern tribes, of course, King Nebuchadnezzar took them, hauled them off into Babylon. The thing that they lost was their identity. And with that, the very core of who they are, the very thing that God gives us, is who we are and our identity in him.
Yes.
And we have lost that. We have lost everything. And then people are just wandering around, everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. And it's crazy land, right? The inmates are running the asylum.
Right. And the result of that is a society and a culture that is endlessly questioning its discrete units of identity.
Yes.
Because of what Tim and you were saying.
The God of identity.
Right. And if you reject the fact that you've been cast as the main character in this story, as an image bearer of God, you have to find purpose and meaning somewhere from some other identity. And so you question and you find that you have to turn from within if you're not going to find it from without. And I think that speaks to much of the identity crisis that we're seeing and the tribalism that is a result of that. And so when we think about one of the concrete answers about looking to scripture to help heal the infections and the problems in society and these difficulties, identity being one of them, then it's like, hey, you were given identity, and it's an identity which was God-given, and that you are a special creation destined for special responsibilities both now and in the future. And that would heal so much fracturing of society where we just pull ourselves apart into a different identity groups in intersectionality and start fighting each other because we're trying to protect one aspect of it and try to instead of seeing ourselves, transcending ourselves above our individual identities and tribes and saying, actually, we're all in this together. And we're
and that's the purpose of the covenant for those who make a covenant with God. The idea is you have a community that's in unity, and it's just crazy out there now. I mean, I keep wondering how many more identities are we going to have? And, is there no end to this? And probably there isn't. So we're in dangerous territory. But, whenever I have conversations with people and I can kind of explain the scriptures in a way that makes sense, encourage them to restore their covenant relationship with God, their identity to be restored, and to go out and do the service and work of the kingdom, that's transformative, and that'll transform a culture. And I'm praying that somehow we have a third great awakening, because Lord only knows we need it. I don't even know what it's going to, it's going to have to be a supernatural move of God, because, all I can do is work in my sphere in the world, where he's placed me, and do my tasks and try to be responsible in that. And then hopefully, like concentric circles, this thing just goes out across the world. I mean, that's all I know to do.
There's one thing I wanted to add, and we may or may not use it, but there's
Okay.
a lovely paragraph in the latter end of your book. I just wanted to read it. We might be able to fit it in somewhere.
Yeah.
Because I just thought it was just so well expressed. Tim and I have been talking today and going over your book and
I think
the best bits. Oh, should I use this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can
He's
edit
got
this
all
one.
I got all mine up here.
Yeah. What is it? 153. Let's have a little look. I'm just going to read it, and I tend not to read to audiences, and we may edit this out, and probably will. But I thought we might as well, now we're here, capture it. It's a paragraph on page 153, and it starts in capital letters, "Be a priest." And I just think the way that it's expressed is it was my favorite. These two pages are my favorite pages. I marked like an underline. So if you don't mind, I will just read.
No, that'd be great.
Okay,
I'd love to hear it because I haven't read my book in a while.
Well, do you know, it's funny when you work on an essay on a book, it's the same. Once it's complete, you're so relieved, and it was such a labor that you're like, I'm gonna I don't want to see another book.
People ask me things in my book. I go, did I actually write that?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
I know sometimes you go back and you read it, you're like, oh, I sound good. I sound good. This is one of the best paragraphs. This is really my favorite paragraph of the book. I think it's so practical. It embodies what it is to be a priest in today's world. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read. Be a priest who cultivates in love the soil of the human heart through prayer and works of service. Read and study the scriptures every day, whole books at a time. Stay loyal and faithful to God's covenant. Set aside time daily to approach the King. Guard your sacred space, its exits and entrances, by what you say, what you hear, and what you allow your eyes to see. Protect your temple from the contamination of the culture. Don't hide in a bubble and pray to escape. Yeshua did not ask the Father to take those who were his out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one in the world. Respond to every confrontation, especially on social media, with a gentle answer, for it turns away wrath. Be kind. Don't compromise your principles ever. Act justly towards everyone. Walk in humility, esteeming others better than yourselves. And I just really appreciate that paragraph. It was just a very high concentrated dose.
Yeah.
Of, Richard, this is what you should be doing, and remember that. So we
Thank you for reminding me. I thought, you know what? It's probably time to put that up on social media.
Oh, 100%. It was
sure.
it was just a nugget of gold, and I've been appreciated reading the book. And Dr. Dinah Dye, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your time and your insights and your wisdom. And we wish you all the best with your third book. And look forward.
Well, thank you so much, Richard and Timothy. I really appreciate you guys inviting me, and I pray for your ministry. It goes far and wide and accomplishes what God's put in your heart. And, I pray people hear and, that you wouldn't even think would even be exposed. That somehow, it transcends all of it. So appreciate your ministry. Hope I get to see you guys sometime. Again, if you're ever in the U.S., if we can ever get on airplanes and go anywhere,
Right.
I can.
Yeah.
And again, just thanks so much. Thank you for thinking of me and having me on. It's been a blessing.
Well, thank you, Dina. It's been a real pleasure.
Our pleasure.